I'm going to mute myself now, and I think, Andy, you are welcome to start.
Thank you. So if we have the time later on, I would love to get to meet everyone who's here and learn about the community that I'm speaking to. I'm so excited to get to know everyone. I want to start by getting us all on the same page in terms of like the theoretical background of what we're talking about and why it's important. And then let's see how much time we have left and have a little bit more of a conversation to the extent that we're able. So I'm just going to start by giving you some background, some information, some theory, and why this actually matters in the fields that we are in. So in worlds like sex education, sex therapy, sexological bodywork, anything, and also things like working with sex retail, anything where the your career, your field, your academia overlaps with the body, overlaps with sexuality specifically, it becomes very high stakes because all of the ways in which we mess with each other and all of the ways in which our own dysfunctions cause harm to one another in professional fields, there's another layer of higher stakes on top of that because there's also our sexualities involved. So it's really important that we do stuff like this responsibly with regard to the likelihood of people getting hurt in professional fields and in professional relationships. When it comes to sex, and also when it comes to pretty much everything else, doing it responsibly doesn't mean try really, really super hard to make sure nothing ever goes wrong, because that's not possible. There's no amount of hard that you can try that will actually effectively make sure that nothing ever goes wrong, right? So what does responsibly mean here? It actually means recognizing that fact, preparing for the eventuality that things are going to go wrong, understanding your field and your relationships well enough that you can prepare for things going wrong, and dealing with your own shadow and your own fears about it in such a way so that when things do go wrong or people do come to you with concerns, you're able to respond maturely, growthfully, and caringly instead of defensively. So that's a big part of the internal work that's necessary for doing things like restorative and transformative justice, sort of getting over that hump of the ingrained idea that, no, I couldn't have done anything wrong because I'm a good person and good people don't do bad things, that we all get trained in so hard in the world that we live in. And that's a type of logic, that carceral logic, right? The logic of the prison industrial complex and the criminal justice system. We're going to talk about that extensively in a minute, but just with a very zoomed out perspective. When we're talking about our personal relationships, our relationships with our colleagues, with our employers, our employees, co-organizers, and clients, all of these relationships require this particular kind of care and responsibility, but they also require it in different ways because of the ways that power infuses the different relationships in different ways. So for example, what it means to be accountable towards your clients with the amount of power that you hold over your clients is different from what it means to be accountable towards, for example, a person who you're contracting for, or a person who you're simply colleagues with or friends with. All of these things require different manifestations of the practice of accountability. And then looking at this group in particular, people who have leadership roles in an organization, that adds an extra layer of responsibility about this, both because that leadership role gives you another position of power, a position of power that you are responsible for dealing with in an ethical way and not misusing intentionally or by accident, but also because as the people who are in leadership roles in the organizations in your field, it's on you to set the culture and set the norms and set the shared expectations for how the people in the field are treating each other. So when you're creating policy and you're enacting that policy, you're also, it's got all of these knock-on effects where it's demonstrating for the people in your field, the people joining your field, and the people looking at your field from the outside, what the culture of the field is. It gets to be up to you what people see when they look at your field, and that's really cool, but it's also a really big responsibility. So what we're going to be talking about is how do you specifically set policy for your organization in such a way that you're also creating the norms and the culture of accountability and care that you want to exist. So in terms of setting the culture, there's also a lot of stuff in the wider culture, the one that we all spend our whole lives marinating in, that we're trying to resist the gravity of and specifically organize counter to. One of those things is what we're going to call carceral logic. So carceral logic is something that we don't talk about very often, but we do all feel in a very visceral way. It's this idea that when somebody commits a harmful act, that changes something fundamental about them. It means that they are bad with a capital B. They are inherently dangerous, and that the only possible and correct response is punishment, and that punishment is the only thing that can heal the harm, right? That harm can only be healed through the suffering of the person that caused the harm. So that's what I mean when I say carceral logic. This idea that if someone does something bad, in the dichotomy of good people and bad people, they are now in the basket bad. And this carceral logic is one of those things that infuses everything we do, every piece of media that we consume, every piece of information that we take in. It's one of those things that has to set itself up as being true about everything, as being inescapable and pervasive in order to be effective. So when we start trying to wedge this thing out of our minds, when we start to try and knock down the walls of the prisons in our heads, there's going to be a lot of resistance. It's going to feel scary. It's going to feel really dangerous because everything we've been taught our whole lives tells us that we need these walls. It tells us that we need these things in order to be safe. Now, this group, the people that I'm speaking to right now, I know that you have at least a little bit of experience unearthing the stuff that you've been taught about how you're supposed to live and looking at it critically. Otherwise, you wouldn't be in this field. And so this is just another opportunity to look at the stuff that you've been taught about how humans live and what it means to live in community, and to say, is this actually real, or is someone benefiting from me believing this when it's not true? Right? So when we get taught something like this so hard, we spend so much time, in schools, in the movie theater, in every piece of culture and media that we consume, we spend so much time getting taught stuff like this. I think about this criminal justice tool, this thing that you learn in law school, which is called cui bono, which is Latin for who benefits. And in criminal law, you think about it for a crime. When you're analyzing what happened with regard to a crime, you think, well, who benefited from the commission of this crime? But I like to use it more broadly. Who benefits from us believing this stuff? Who benefits from us being incapable of imagining an alternative to the carceral system? So carceral logic also keeps things on a very surface level, identifying individual acts of violence as a problem, and as a problem that derives directly from the presence of bad people in our midst, which bad people need to be extracted and thrown away. That's the process. That's how it works in the system that we've been taught. The types of work that we're talking about here, which we can call broadly restorative and transformative justice, identify individual acts of violence as symptoms of a larger problem. These systems invite us to ask why, rather than simply trying to throw away and cover up the problem. So shifting that reflexive urge to throw away into an urge to ask why dials back our reliance on the criminal justice system and its power over our lives by addressing the roots of violence instead of the leads. So what are we talking about when we talk about restorative and transformative justice, right? It sounds like some hippie shit. It sounds very pie in the sky, but it's actually really simple. These practices are simply a systematization of how we treat each other when we love each other. So for example, let's imagine a stranger takes your wallet. What inferences do you make about what just happened? What's your instinctive reaction? It's probably something like, a bad person attacked me. I have to call the authorities. I'm unsafe. I need help from the police or from, some authoritative figure. Now, to be clear, this is different for different people. Your instinct is much more likely to be to call the police if you are a white person and you spent your formative years being taught that the police are there to protect you. But the thing that holds true for everyone in situations that activate our fight or flight responses is that we regress to younger mindsets and seek the solutions that we were taught as children. We rely on the logics that we were taught as children. So when we're in danger or when we feel ourselves to be in danger, we end up using these really binary understandings of right and wrong because that's the way that children understand it. And this is something that was created for us to believe on purpose. Because if we didn't believe that bad people deserve to be punished, if that belief wasn't deeply and reflexively implanted in our animal minds, we would never tolerate the existence of prisons and the systems of human disposal that hold them up. And if the whole population rejected that logic and rejected the existence of prisons themselves, then our whole economy, which runs on prison slave labor, would fall down. And then where would we be? So when we try to dislodge this stuff from inside ourselves, we're fighting through a lot. But the good news is that we already have the blueprint for treating each other as if we love each other. We already know how to do that. So let's imagine that instead of a stranger taking your wallet, you discover that your best friend took your wallet, or maybe a family member, someone that you love. Think about how your reflexive response differs. Maybe your first urge is towards something like, oh no, something must be really wrong, or my friend must be in big trouble if they felt like they couldn't ask me for what they needed. Notice how instead of focusing on the need for retribution, in that circumstance, your initial instinct is curiosity and care. So when we take that instinct and we institute it as a broader practice, it's called restorative and transformative justice. So restorative and transformative justice is a theory of justice that emphasizes repairing the harm caused by the behavior at issue. It's best accomplished through cooperative processes that involve anyone who has a stake in the matter to participate. Although there's a lot of different ways that processes can look, and there's no one right answer. In the best case scenario, these processes lead to the transformation of people, relationships, and communities to bring them more into alignment with their own visions of what they could be. So where did these ideas come from? It's really hard to say because they kind of came from everywhere. This idea of sitting in circle and dealing with harm and justice as a community is the oldest idea in the world. Different modern practices of restorative and transformative justice are based on different ancestral links. So most people now work with a blended practice. So I'm personally trained in a practice that's originally derived from New Zealand or Aboriginal talking circle practices. But the important thing for all of you to know is that if you go far enough back in your own heritage, there's almost certainly a practice of sitting in circle somewhere in there. It's just something that humans naturally gravitate towards all throughout time and all over the globe. So the modern practices of restorative and transformative justice, what the movement looks like now, was started by Black women. It was started by women in Black radical activist communities who were realizing when they found themselves experiencing sexual and intimate partner violence in the 70s within their communities. Obviously, they couldn't go to the police because they were fighting the police. So they had to find new ways of responding to harm that did not require state violence. So today, there are a couple of ways that these practices are being used. They're being used a lot, for example, in schools. Children, school-age children, are being taught to sit in circle and to lead circles themselves, so that when they encounter conflict between themselves, they have the tools to solve it. And that this is actually the bulk of restorative practices today. Most academia, most of the field today is made by educators for children. It's also being instituted in the criminal justice system to some extent as post-pleas diversionary circles. So what that means is that instead of getting sentenced to, for example, prison time or a fine, a person who is convicted of a minor crime in some jurisdictions can be sentenced to sitting in circle with the person or people who were harmed by their actions. And then the more common, another common practice that is used today is a community circle, and that's the kind that I do. So a community circle, obviously circle, the term kind of speaks for itself. It's a little harder to do under these pandemic circumstances, but traditionally what you would do is literally sit in a circle. That's a really important part of how it works. And there's a talking piece, there's an item of some kind. Sometimes it's a ritual item, sometimes it's just a rock, sometimes it's whatever you find around the house. It gets passed from hand to hand. The person who's holding the talking piece talks and everybody else listens. It's as simple as that. And also it is a stupendously difficult and complex practice. So one of the important things about it is that it needs to be an independent, freestanding model for the resolution of community conflict. So I was taught that sitting in circle needs to be 90% community building and 10% conflict resolution. So I say this to tell you that when you institute policies and practices, they can't just be Band-Aids. They can't just be things that you bring in and activate during times when there is a problem. They have to be ongoing practices for your community, because we don't already have the muscles of dealing with this type of problem, sitting in circle, responding to harm. And so we need to strengthen and practice those muscles before we're able to use them.
Your audio just went, Andy.
Oh no, did you miss?
Just the last sentence, the last bit.
Okay. Can you hear me okay? Okay. Let me just check my input. Is that better? Okay,
yeah,
great.
and it might have been on Dolly's end because I actually heard everything you said. So.
Okay, great. Well, just to make sure you caught that last bit, the important thing to know is that when you institute policies and practices as an organization, they can't just be stuff that you activate in the event of a problem. They have to be ongoing practices. Because what we're really talking about is a different paradigm, a different way of coming at this stuff. And it has to be part of your whole life and your whole practice. It can't just be a reparative measure that's brought in when something goes wrong. So there's a system. Let me see. I feel like we maybe don't have the time for me to rant about capitalism today, but if you want to hear rants about capitalism, call me back for another session. But we're going to keep it a little quicker today. So the medicine of restorative justice is very new for the bodies, for the collective body of our communities and our wider human community. It's also as old as being human. It's just unfamiliar to the way that we live right now because it is so different from what we've been taught will keep us safe. There's a theorist who does generative somatics named Tada Hazumi, who says that the revolution will be titrated. And that means that when we introduce medicine into the collective body, we have to do it carefully in order to allow it to integrate. So when we start acting as if in our individual lives and our individual practices, as if we don't need state violence to tell us whose lives are important, it allows the medicine to start to take hold. And every time people sit in circle together in the modern world, every time people take that step of resistance of that dehumanization, that's how the medicine spreads. So just to bring in some practical ideas so you're an organization for what you can institute practically, the types of things that you can do, that you have the power to do right now, and that will actually make a difference. So, like I said at the beginning, a big part of your responsibility is to foster a culture and set norms. Now, this means a couple of things. One is that it's your job to be clear and transparent about what types of behavior are and are not acceptable. That means both behavior like mistreatment of clients, exploitation of the power relationships inherent in your work, that sort of thing, but also the types of behavior that we see in, what could broadly be called cancel culture, right? The idea that the thing to do when there's a problem is create an internet firestorm to effectively destroy someone's career and ability to be alive. That's something that I see a lot of right now, and I think that it's a harmful perversion of what we could otherwise call community justice, because it's not people coming together to grow as a community. It's just sort of the reflexive urge to punish, but acted out individually instead of through state violence. It's not actually better. So making it clear that that is not the appropriate response to problems in your spaces, in your culture, in your organization, but also in so doing, presenting a functional alternative. Because we can't say, well, no internet dogpiling, but also, just figure it out on your own. So in order to say that type of behavior is not what we do in this community, it's really important to create alternatives that take the needs and voices of survivors seriously, that make it easy for them to report and to know what's going to happen when they report, and that make it possible for people to take accountability and have that actually mean something and have an effect. So that's the other thing that it means to be setting these norms, to cultivate an atmosphere where people feel safe enough to both seek and take accountability. We don't tend to identify being hurt or recognize that we have caused hurt unless we feel safe. So we're talking about balancing taking this seriously and not throwing anyone away, so that someone who needs to share a story, someone who needs to ask for help, knows that they will be taken seriously, they will be cared for, and their needs will be heard. But also the people who are being come to with stories have enough solidity and security in their community that they don't fear being thrown away, which allows them to respond from a place of generosity rather than defensiveness. That's the most common thing that you have to overcome, right, in this situation, is that defensiveness. And that defensiveness is based in carceral logic. Because if you're told you did something wrong, it clicks into the mechanism of carceral logic that you've been taught and becomes, you're going to be thrown away. Your life is now worthless. You're going to die. You don't have a community anymore. And of course, we would want to defend against that. Anyone would. And so what that looks like is defending against having done something wrong. No, I wouldn't do that. I'm a good person. I would never hurt anybody. So in saying that, in that defensive reaction, what people are actually doing is saying, please don't throw me away. Please don't kick me out. Please don't kill me. Right? We're not actually talking about death, but like to the hindbrain, it feels like death. And so the thing to keep that from happening is to build a sense of security and a transparent culture of growthful accountability that will allow people to not have to react with that defensiveness because they know they're not going to be thrown away. In the same way as if you imagine a relationship that you have in your life where you know you can go to that person and say, hey, that thing you said yesterday extremely hurt my feelings and I feel very bad about it and I want to talk to you about it. And you know that your relationship is strong enough to take it. You know that your relationship is strong enough to actually grow and improve from that kind of thing rather than be broken by it. So practically, it's also really important to have a mechanism that's flexible enough to deal with different types of problems, right? Because some problems require accountability. Some problems require an individual to get better at doing something well or responsibly or gently or carefully until they can no longer make the mistakes they were making. Some problems require community transformation. Maybe there's a community norm that's not being enforced effectively. Maybe there's something that the whole community isn't actually on the same page on. Maybe there are some ways in which the community is not holding up its end of keeping its people safe, and everybody needs to work on it. Everybody needs to transform. And then there are some problems where people will actually need to be kicked out. And I want to be very clear. It's not that there are no circumstances under which someone needs to have their licensure removed or whatever it is. There are certainly those. There are certainly people that have refused to participate meaningfully in their community and in so doing have waived their ability to be in that community. Just that kicking people out can't be your first or only tool. It should be a tool in a broad and creative toolbox. So your responsibility towards your members when they have been accused of hurting someone or when they have hurt someone is number one, to take it seriously, not to say, oh, no, I know that guy, I like him. It's not, I'm sure it's fine, right? But to take it seriously. But also to deal with them from a place of care, to not immediately jump to disposal. What this means is preparing for this to happen so that you're not flailing, you're not panicking, you're not trying to build the plane as you're flying it. And then your responsibilities as an organization towards survivors is to, number one, make it easy and accessible for them to talk to you. Let them know that you're going to trust them and believe them. And also to try to restore power and agency to them in every possible way. So for example, one of the things that I do when I'm serving as this, ombudsman for organizations, where people who have a complaint or have an issue or have something they want to talk to someone about, they email or they fill out a form or whatever it is the organization has instituted, and it goes to me. And the organization or the company has me on retainer. One of the things that I do is I always make sure to give the survivor control over the medium of the conversation, over the timing of the conversation, over the content of the conversation, over the extent to which the conversation is disclosed or not disclosed to anyone. I make sure that they know that in every step of the way, nothing is more important than their safety and their agency. So as we're creating structures, that's really important to prioritize, letting them know there's absolutely nothing. The well-being of the organization is not more important than this. The well-being of the person that hurt you is not more important than this, because if those things conflict and we prioritize the organization or the responsible party over the survivor, that means that there's a problem in our policy. So the other important responsibilities that you have are, number one, don't be afraid of conflict. I guess that's number three, sorry. Don't be afraid of conflict. Approach it as an opportunity to grow and to identify areas of alignment and growthful misalignment. When we back away from conflict, we let misalignments sit and fester, and it's not usually helpful. And then also not to flatten the issues, making tools to do the work available to the people who are willing to use them, thereby setting themselves apart from people who aren't. I always say, not everybody is going to take the chance if you give it to them, but everybody deserves it. So if you give people the chance to respond to having harmed someone with care and restoration and transformation, they may or may not take it. And that's just a true thing and a bummer. People might be too wrapped up in being defensive or in being afraid or in their self-conception of being an innocent person. They might be too focused inside to recognize that someone else might have a different experience of interaction than they do. For whatever reason, they might not be ready to really truly internalize the fact that maybe I didn't want to hurt someone, maybe I did not intend to hurt someone, but the actions that I took, the things that I did, the things that I said hurt this person, and it's my responsibility to deal with it. They might not be ready to do that. Not everybody is, but some people are. And so having the tools to offer accountability to people who are ready to take them, and to respond appropriately and with a prioritization of safety if people aren't ready to take them. That's a kind of discernment that's really crucial for people in your position, because people who are coming at this from a sort of predatory perspective are used to hiding. They're used to being camouflaged by all of the people who are just sort of unintentionally acting out the stuff that they've learned their whole lives about bodies and agency and gender and stuff. They're used to just an ocean of open-hearted fuck-ups to hide in. And as that ocean starts to diminish by people who commit open-hearted fuck-ups, receiving feedback open-heartedly and doing the work, they're going to stand out more. And that's always hard and scary for them. So it is important to prepare for that and know that it's going to happen, and you need to be able to deal with it when it does. So I have, as you can probably tell, I could just yammer about this all day, but I would like to open it up for questions. I know we have a little bit more time than we were worried about, but I also know that everyone here is in sort of different stages of learning about this and of opening themselves up to it. I would love to hear from any of you who want to share, if you have questions, if you have thoughts, but also as you're listening to these ideas, what does it feel like is standing between you and implementing them? What feels like the obstacle or the barrier right now?
Hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you, yeah.
Hi Andy, thank you so much. This has been amazing. I do quite a lot of stuff in Circle, and I can only be on here for another 5 minutes or so. However, for me, the biggest thing that is getting in the way is there's a lot of stuff happened. So where do you start? Do you go into the past of the stuff that's happened? Do you go into the stuff that's happening now? Do you go into the stuff in the future? So I've not seen any of this personally in somatic sex education or sexological bodywork. I'm based over in the UK. I know of people in other modalities related to sexuality where there has been this kind of process, and I welcome everything that you said. And I agreed with actually everything. For me, I think there's a piece where we have to look at ourselves now. I wonder, of the people on this call, is there like you know, when you put in a new rule and then everybody has an opportunity to kind of say the things that have happened to them or their experiences, so you can just kind of start with a clean slate. I feel like an amnesty, or I'm not sure the right words, but I feel like that might be necessary, because I think this is new for our field, but I'm relatively new to this field, so I may just not know the history. But I think that's probably the big thing, and the fact that we've got different geographical locations with different codes of ethics and no actual proper code of conduct yet, and that's something that we're working on. So there's a lot.
Yeah.
I don't know if any of that made sense.
No, totally. I mean, a lot of what you're saying, it sounds like there's just so much. There's so much history. There's so much trauma. There's so many people doing so many things that are related but different. How could we ever start to institute shared norms on top of this mountain of past and present events?
Yeah, and I think the fact, like, you know, I've studied gender, sexuality, and relationship diversity, so I know a lot about minority stress and things like that. But I don't think the minority statuses and those aspects are taught in our work. So I think there's a lot of people in positions where they believe they're not doing anything wrong with it, which are doing things that may be low level wrong rather than the big ticket wrong items. And so there's kind of a general foundation level of what's okay. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and actually, I think this is a really good point that you've hit on, because I think it's really, really valuable to start with little things, because, like I said, we're titrating this, right? We're starting to exercise a new muscle, and it is much, much better to be able to have conversations or to have accountability around stuff that's relatively minor, to work your way up to being able to do it about larger stuff. And that way, when you know that you're going to sit in circle, or you know that you need to have a hard conversation, it doesn't feel like the end of the world, because it's just a normal part of your life, right? Like if you and I had a relationship, for example, where I know our relationship is strong. I know if I'm upset about even something that's really little, even if it feels really stupid, I know that you care about me and you want me to feel safe with you. And so I know that it is a mutual kindness if I tell you, you know, hey, I really wish you would just stop chewing gum in my ear. You know, I know it's tiny, I know it's silly, but like, I just really wish you would stop chewing gum in my ear. Like, if you really care about me, you want to know that, right? That it drives me up a wall, even if it's small.
Yeah.
And having that conversation where you say, thank you for the feedback. I will absolutely stop chewing gum in your ear because I love you and I want you to be happy. The more we have that on a small scale, the safer I feel to come to you with bigger stuff, because I have this body of evidence of you reacting well to me asking you for that kind of support.
Yeah, and absolutely. And one more thing, just to say, I think there's a baseline requirement for some gender, sex, and relationship diversity training, so that when something is raised, it's not seen as something that's not actually an issue when it actually is. Because I'm concerned that the committee is not as diverse as it needs to be, and there may not be enough representation. So that's a thing. I am so sorry, but I have to go, and I'm so glad it's been recorded, and I'm really glad this is happening, and I'm gonna go now. But thank you.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Yeah, go ahead, Casia.
Hi, I'm Casia.
Casia.
Thanks, Andy, for being with us today. I am on the board of the ACSB, and I'm curious. I'm hearing you talk about building like a nurturing community so that people feel safe to participate in harm resolution. And I'm noticing in my body, just like, oh my God, just like, it sounds like more time to commit to a process that like we're already stretching ourselves for time to volunteer to be on this board and participate in committees and involve conversations. And I'm curious, are there ways to build that nurturing community that don't require people to come onto calls consistently throughout the month or year? And like, how do we structure it in a way that like acknowledges that time is a reality in our work lives and real lives and all the things? Do you have any suggestions?
Yeah, I mean, if it does take effort to build things. That said, I think part of that nurturing and interdependent community is allocating the effort in such a way that it doesn't burn anyone out. So putting in a little extra time at the beginning to agree on what you all want to see done, and then figure out who's actually able to do it so that you can pick up the slack for each other and it doesn't fall on the heads of people who don't have the capacity for it. I think that'll allow you to all feel some ownership of it, you know, and have the opportunity to work on it without it being too much of without it being a time commitment that you can't actually deal with.
And then a follow-up to that would be that we have a membership base, which is amazing. We're starting to have this community of members, but there's no requirement for them to participate in community calls or be accountable like on an ongoing way with each other. Like there are people who are just members on our website. So how do we create a foundation to invite them in? I'm like curious about that part. Yeah. Like how do we create the community when it's not like a requirement?
Right. I mean, it sounds like the question that you're asking is like, what does it mean to be part of the ACSB community? And that is a decision that the ACSB has to make. If it means that there are some shared norms and expectations for behavior, then that's a decision that the community needs to make together and be willing to enforce. If it means that participation in this community means committing to participating in, I don't know, one phone call a month, so that you're able to all be in contact at least a little bit, that's a decision you have the authority to make, and could plausibly make. You know, it is certainly reasonable to say that if somebody wants to be a member of your organization, that has to mean something. Go ahead, Dolly.
My question is a little bit of a follow-up from what Casia said. Like thinking about if there's a meetup, you know, once a week, once a month on Facebook, something like that, where these smaller things can be brought up. We can all get practice in this circle kind of a thing. If we were to identify some people from our membership or board to train in restorative justice, what does that take? And then I do have a follow-up question as it relates to if we have a bigger emergency that we need to deal with. So I want to just quickly ask about the RJ process, how long that takes.
It's definitely a good idea to get some of your members trained up. There are a lot of different trainings. There's a lot of different practices. I got trained at the Restorative Center, which is in New York. There's also one called an organization called Planning Change that I think is doing online trainings. But the National Conference of Restorative and hold on. It's one of those really long acronyms, you know. National Association of Community and Restorative Justice, NACRJ, has a resource and training list. Okay. Mostly getting trained as a circle keeper takes a weekend. There are some advanced trainings that take a week. But like I was saying earlier, it's not like it is a skill that you have to be trained, but also it's something that like our bodies want to do is sit in circle. And so a lot of the training is learning how to deal with conflict in the circle and learning sort of the structures around it, but it's not hard. It's just a larger scale of energy work than working with one individual.
Is it better for a new society like ours to if we identify somebody or somebody in the committee, or it rotates, to be the collector of complaints, or is it better to have an outside person like you kind of being the ombudsman?
I think you can do it either way. The important thing, as I understand it, is to have somebody, to have not just one person if it's inside, because you need, right, let's say it's you, and then someone, and everyone knows that it's you, right? Your name is on there, and then someone needs to make a complaint about you.
Mm-hmm.
So it's important that there be some options. One of the organizations that I work with is instituting a rotating committee where all of their names are available, all of their contact information is available, and someone who wants to make a complaint can email any of them or call any of them.
Okay.
You can also use an outside person, but you don't have to.
Okay. And then my last question is, you talked about the step about making it safe and easy for people who have complaints to come forward. What about somebody who is accused? How does that person get invited in? If it's within the ACSB, is it at our cost? Is it at the person who's been accused costs? How does circle happen? Does the person then face everybody at once? Is it one-on-one? And then also, because my mind is trying to step away from the carceral kind of mentality, how do people who've come forward, how do they feel safe that we're taking it seriously if some sort of a public statement isn't made or something like that? Do you know what I mean? Because there's some sort of element of some punitive, something that they're like, oh, that feels okay. I can't explain, or maybe
No, it makes sense. It totally makes sense. So there are two separate questions, so let me answer them separately. The first one was, how does an accused person get invited to participate? Usually, whoever you have that does the facilitation, whether that's me or whether you get someone trained up, is going to make the initial contact with the accused person, subject to the boundaries discussed with the person bringing the complaint. So sometimes the person bringing the complaint is going to say, I don't want you to use my name, but you can share my story, or I do want you to use my name and I actually want to talk to them myself. It's one of the places in which prioritizing the agency of the harmed party is really crucial. But I also suggest, if you have policies and procedures that are publicly on your website, that one of those policies and procedures be, a complaint was just made about me, what do I do? Because when people have that happen, when they get that initial reach out, they're going to panic, right? And their first defensive reaction is often going to be to try to get as much information as possible. And so giving them the information that they can have in a way that's easy and accessible is really helpful. Because remember that one of the goals is to not be punishing them with the process itself. And that's something that we're not taught how to do. And that does sort of lead into your next question, which is, how does the complainant get any sort of resolution if there isn't necessarily a public statement? Sometimes there is a public statement, but the answer is that the person who brought the complaint is as involved in the process as they want to be. So in some cases, they're going to be very closely involved. They're sitting in circle with the responsible person. They are reviewing drafts before statements go out. They're responding to questions. They're initiating things. In some processes, they're less involved because they would prefer to be less involved, but it just depends on the process. But in most cases, the survivor, the complaining party, they have access to as much information about what's going on as they want. And so it wouldn't be that they would only know what happened if there was a public statement. Rather, they would be circled in to the extent that they wanted to know what was going on. There could be a public statement. In some cases, that's part of the accountability plan that's made collaboratively by the responsible party and the harmed party, but not in all cases. In my experience, a public statement is usually more punitive than it is restorative. But if it's the type of conflict where there's already a lot of public discourse about it and everybody's got sort of misinformation and gossip and confusion, it may be that a public statement is helpful. It just isn't always. Does that help?
It does. It still has a lot of unanswered, things in terms of the policy that must be created. And then in terms of like not making like a certain public statement, but this idea of innocent until proven guilty, but if so many complaints are put forth, then if we are being gentle and preparing somebody who's been accused, like we're holding them in their space, but then also maybe muting them from participation in terms of like our society, I guess. So do we collectively have to make these decisions, like what's best for the community, or giving people free will until all of the circle stuff is handled?
So I usually find that it's best to invite them to not silence themselves, but like take a step back until things have been resolved. And in a lot of cases, people who are genuinely and open-heartedly invested in accountability will voluntarily do that, because they want to make sure that whatever deficiencies in their vision or their responsibility or their practice caused harm to the people around them are corrected before they are fully participating again. Because if someone comes to them and says, hey, you messed up in your job and you hurt someone real bad, someone who's genuinely invested in accountability is going to say, let me hold off on doing my job until I fix whatever the problem was, right? So it's not about saying as a punishment you have to step back for a while, but as a protective measure.
Dolly, it looks like you just muted yourself. So do you feel complete with those questions? I have follow-up questions which might help give us more details here. We're hungry. Andy, you can tell we're hungry for details.
It's great. I also see a question from Kian. I want you to know I see you. I'll get to you after.
Okay. Sorry, Kian. Thank you. So yeah, we can't make somebody participate. We can't wish somebody into that mindset you're describing, where the very first response after that really reflexive nervous system response of defensiveness is, oh my God, what? I've fucked up. I don't even know what you're talking about. I feel like that can't be true, but I'm going to step back and quiet myself, and I want to know. We can't make them have that response. So if we are creating this culture diligently and dutifully, and the person who's accused does not do that, just decides to either obfuscate the process or one way or another can't come around, what's our process then? How do we bring the process forward? What's our recourse?
So there are some things that can be done from a transformative practice that don't necessarily involve the responsible party if they're refusing to participate. In a lot of cases, refusing to participate is a form of refusing to participate in community.
Yeah.
And the response to that is to say, if you're not willing to participate in this community in a meaningful way, you are functionally removing yourself from this community. And in some cases, that's the answer. And then the responsibility then falls to the rest of the community to take a hard look inside and say, what are the ways in which we have participated in creating the conditions that allowed this to happen? Because this definitely, nothing that happens in a vacuum or because of one person. And so every person in the community has a part to play in creating the conditions that allow someone to behave badly and not respond well when confronted with that. And it's an opportunity for everyone else, once that person has stepped back, to examine how the community itself can transform away from violence and towards healing.
Wonderful. I have a follow-up question on that. And so in terms of what we do then with the harmed, if the person accused refuses to step up, but there's this pool of harmed people, well, if they do or don't step up, there's a pool of harmed people who have come forward, and a pattern of harm is established from these independent statements. What if there's enough fear in the body of the harmed collective that virtually no one wants to actually represent the harm? They want us to do it instead, or they don't want to come forward and sit in community. There's too much fear. That too is a byproduct of the community we've created and the culture we live in. But does it ever happen that the association actually represents the harmed and puts forth these statements, and the harmed don't ever actually represent themselves?
It's possible, but it's difficult. One thing that I have seen done, and one organization that you can look at for an example of this, is called Hidden Water, which works specifically with families that have had child sexual abuse, where there are separate circles. There's one circle where the harmed parties sit together and cultivate healing together, and then there's a separate party for the a separate circle for the responsible party with their support system, where the stories and the information is brought to them, but not by the people that actually were harmed, so that they're able to integrate the information and the need for work and transformation in a place where the harmed parties are insulated from their reaction. And then eventually the two circles can come together once everybody has practiced sitting in circle enough that it's going to be a little more reliable and predictable. So Hidden Water has one circle for the harmed parties from the different families, and one circle for the responsible parties from the different families, one circle for like siblings who weren't themselves abused. And people sit in circle with members of other families that had the same position as they did. And they do that for, I think it's a year before they ever sit in circle with their own family. Kian, I think you had a question.
Yeah, hi, thanks. So just firstly, thank you. I'm quite new to this model. I've been reading about it, and this is helping. Something I thought of when you were saying to build a process that's ongoing was the Come Clean process from Cuddle Party, which is a thing that I've been doing that I relate to, that builds a way of bringing things like that to the front, and also positive interactions. And the question I had was related to Christiane's about, I've been involved with 3 different processes with 3 different people from 3 different communities, not this one, with people who for various reasons couldn't see harm or wouldn't acknowledge it, or were involved in lengthy processes and continue to harm And you suggested that they could step back. And what if they refuse to step back?
I mean, look, part of having norms in your community is having the ability to enforce them. There's no, it's not actually a dichotomy between either we buy into a punitive model, and if someone does something wrong, we immediately kick them out, remove their license, and do everything bad to them that we can think of, or we hold people and we give them opportunities for growth, and we never damage anyone. We'd never take any steps that might damage anyone's ability to practice. Those two things are not distinct, because if we are starting by holding people, we're starting by offering people opportunities to learn and become better practitioners and better community members and safer humans to be around, and they're refusing those opportunities. And we're saying, listen, if you're not meaningfully participating in our community, if you're not willing to prioritize the norms of our community over your own desires, that's you not being a part of our community. What does it mean for this person to not be a part of your community? Does it mean the removal of a certification? Does it mean the removal of a listing on a site? Does it mean sharing information with interested parties or with other professional organizations to ensure that someone who's refusing to take accountability can't just go off and do the same thing somewhere else? Like, there are lots of tools to mitigate the harm that can be caused by an individual who's refusing to take accountability. But those tools should be used protectively and not punitively. So we're not talking about how do we damage someone, how do we stop them from being able to live, right? We're talking about how do we ensure that they are less able to cause the harm that they're not willing to stop causing.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions at this point? All right, I see Yuri, and then Kasia, and then Elisa.
Andy, I also just wanted to thank you for the presentation. I really enjoyed it. One question that I often make, and the people who are with me in the committee probably tired of hearing me say this again, but please bear with me, everyone. Would like to ask about, do you have any experience on how does those processes translate from one culture to another? I really enjoyed that you spoke about a process that goes in the Maori in the New Zealand, because when I see and when I read about transformative justice and I research about it, most of it comes from a Northern Hemisphere perspective. And I'm located in Brazil right now. So we have I do understand that I do have a different cultural window than other processes, and some of them just doesn't seem to fit on this reality due to a series of, I can also talk at length about this, like I said. So do you have any resources, or can you point something that, where could I find those? Or because I see some things that sometimes things don't translate easily, and I find myself a bit lost in this one.
Yeah, well, I know that there are a lot of circle practices that derive from African diasporic traditions. So that might be a place to start, coming from, looking at practices that are Southern Hemisphere. But I think that that one thing you might be able to do is to try to reverse engineer what a practice consistent with your own culture and your own heritage might look like by seeing if there's anyone else doing this work in your region. And if so, what practices are they trained in? Where did they get their information? Because it might be that there are, you said you're in Brazil? It might be that there are indigenous Brazilian circle practices. It might be that there are circle practices that are already in your own heritage that are being practiced today. And if that's the case, then you have an amazing opportunity to practice those and incorporate those into your ACSB work, which would be cool as hell. And so I think it's just a question of broadening your horizons, talking to the people that are doing related work to your field, and finding where the Venn diagram overlap lies.
Thank you.
I have Casia.
Hi. So I'm hearing you talk about inviting people to step down, and then I'm curious about, because you mentioned as like one of the things that could be a protective action is removing someone's profile on a membership listing. So I'm curious about the distinction between what does it look like for someone to step down? Does it mean that they're just not like public for a while? And at what point do we take that measure for them? Is it when they're not unwilling to act in the process that we start to step in and take those procedures? Is it our responsibility, if we get a grievance, to take that person's membership off the site immediately? Or do we leave it until we know if they're willing to participate in the process?
So the answer to your question is that it doesn't matter as much how you do it as it matters that you decide how you're going to do it and you be transparent about it. Because let's imagine I'm a member, right? And someone makes a complaint about me and you immediately take down my profile, hypothetically. I didn't know you were going to do that. I had no way of knowing because you don't have a publicly available policy. And so, of course, without having any information, all you have is this complaint. It's definitely going to put us on an adversarial footing. So hypothetically, if you had, when someone was signing up to be a member, or when someone was signing up to be part of, to be listed on the site, I don't know how your website works, but when someone's signing up to be a member, whatever that means, if part of that signing up or part of that application is, here are our procedures around grievances and complaints. This is how it works. This is what would happen if you made a complaint about someone. And this is what would happen if someone made a complaint about you. If you're cool with these procedures, continue. If you don't want to be part of an organization that has these procedures, that's on you, right? You get to be a participant in whatever community spaces have norms and practices that align with yours to the extent that you want. And if you give people the opportunity to see what your norms and practices are when they're deciding whether or not they want to be part of your community spaces, then they already know. And so if you take the actions or the practices that you've described in your policies, once they've already been promulgated, it's going to be a lot easier. So it can be that your policy is, we get a grievance, we take down your listing until the grievance is resolved. It can be, we wait until the grievance, has taken X, Y, or Z steps before we take down your listing. Whatever it is, as long as you're transparent about it with the people who are subject to grievances and the people who are making them, that's what's important.
And then just one more follow-up question, if that's okay.
Sure.
So if someone does refuse to participate in the process and is removed from the community, what's our responsibility? I mean, even if we have practitioners out in the world who are not part of any association or are not a member of anything, and we get a complaint about them, is it our responsibility as an association to have somewhere on the website that says we don't recommend working with this person? I'm confused about that as well. It's just
well, I think having a blacklist is usually a bad idea. But just as a piece of advice as an organization, I think what you could do is be clear about the standards of behavior that are required for someone to be a member of your organization. And then say on your website, we don't recommend working with practitioners who are not members of our organization, because being a member of our organization requires a certain level of agreeing to behavioral norms and standards of ethics. And if someone is not a member of this organization, they have not agreed to those norms and standards of ethics. And therefore, we wouldn't vouch for their ethics, we wouldn't vouch for their practice, and you would be better off working with someone who's a member here. That's part of what this membership organization does.
That's super useful. Thank you.
I saw a question from Elisa.
Yeah, I guess I was going back to, I think near the beginning, and you mentioned that sitting in circle kind of required like 90% or something of community building before you deal with too many complainant procedures. And yeah, we do have like difficulty of being in so many different areas, and you get a larger and larger, hopefully get a larger and larger group. Do you have some particular processes of like, do you split up in smaller groups, or like what would be the process that you might suggest for building community in an association like ours?
You know, it's going to vary enormously based on the field. And of course, right now, when our ability to do stuff in person at all is really diminished, it becomes even harder. But I would say that having some kind of regular ability to connect with one another, whether it's like a weekly happy hour or a weekly or monthly or bi-monthly or whatever it is, talking circle where, you know, you're just there to talk and be in community and connect with the people that are doing the thing that you do, some way of regularly reaffirming and strengthening those connections, regardless of how frequent it is or how extensive it is, just some sort of touch that happens regularly, I think is a good place to start. I imagine that smaller groups will bloom out of that. That tends to happen, I think, in professional associations where there are strong community ties. But I think having a rhythmic ability to touch base is a good start. Yeah, that's Dolly.
My question is about timing. And you mentioned something that one of the issues that can be difficult for somebody who is accused is not knowing what's going on and not knowing what the complaints are. So in terms of timing, can things, unless like people who are complaining are saying that they want to be, their name wants to be known, they want to be part of the process, can complaints be forwarded anonymously and or presented by multiple people from the committee or the board? I'm just trying to figure out process and kind of next steps so in terms of like how that information is received or landed for the person accused. And then secondly, what is average timing? You know, taking these things into consideration, do we take the people making the complaints timeline as more of a priority, or the person who's the accused, their timeline and when they're ready to deal with this?
So I think it's, for the first question, it depends on the complainants. You know, you can, if you have someone who's established some trust with your complainants, it's usually possible to say, look, in the process of me helping with this, it would be really helpful if I could just strip the identifying information off of your complaint and bring it to the person who harmed you so that we can start working on and identifying the behaviors that they need to change in order to not do stuff like that in the future. In a lot of cases, that's okay with them. You know, and so building that level of trust with the harmed party is really important from the get-go. And then in terms of timeline, a lot of people find this stuff moves more slowly than they want it to. And I think it's important to manage expectations for everybody involved about how long stuff is going to take. Because when someone, you know what, it's like part of my day job is doing divorce, and everyone is always super pissy that their divorce takes so long, because by the time they make it to me, they've already gone through this whole internal process of grappling with deciding to divorce. And finally they're ready, and finally they're ready to do it after all of this indecision and all of this time. And then I'm like, okay, it's time to start this, 2-year process. And they're mad that it's not already happened at the time when they finally got to me, right? And I think it's a similar problem where when someone brings a complaint to you, or someone is receiving a complaint, there's already been this whole long process of them trying to decide what they're going to do, and psyching themselves up and changing their mind, and not knowing what to do, and trying to figure out, how to deal with it. And so the timeline, any timeline that's longer than, all right, it's already dealt with, abracadabra, can feel really unsatisfactory. And so starting out by managing everyone's expectations around that is a good idea. And then just sort of balancing the timeline for the harmed party and the responsible party. It just takes a little bit of practice, because the timeline for the responsible party definitely needs to be taken into account, because you can't rush somebody's ability to grow. But also if tons of time is passing and the harmed party sees nothing happening, they're going to start to feel like, well, I guess nothing's happening. So it's just about being communicative and managing expectations.
Okay. Thank you.
I'm afraid that it is actually time for me to run off.
Thank you, Andy.
But it has been a real pleasure talking to all of you, and please don't hesitate to give me a call back if you have any further questions or if you want to do this again.